But in its most basic sense, it's the mystic arm and thinking and teaching of Judaism. It also became very popular in Europe in maybe the turn of the 19th century, somewhere late, something like that. 19th century definitely, I think, where you had a lot of these romantics and mystics and hermetic philosophers and all these other people. And they took a lot of these ideas that had been running around in the culture for the last couple of thousand years, because they weren't gone in between. They just were sort of underground. And really bringing them up and practicing with them, and that's where you have, some of these... That's where I think it got a particularly weird cast by people like Aleister Crowley, who actually was an amazing guy. I mean, he knew very, very well what he was doing. But, weird sort of, sexual rituals and association with Satanism and all of these other sorts of things, which again are sort of stuff put on top of it. But, so it's really just a group of people thinking about things, and then other people think about it as well. But what's kind of cool about it is it's specifically dealing with, I think the most important question in Kabbalah is, how do things become manifest? How do you go from there being nothing to being something? And that's actually a really profound question. And that's also a really profound question, again, in some of this work that I do, because one of the things I've discovered about myself is that I have a great deal of orientation towards the concept of change in and of itself. How do things change? How does something come into creation that wasn't there before? And all of that is very closely related to that, those Kabbalistic ideas. Some of the images I think that people might be aware of from the Kabbalah are things like the tree of life. And, there's no coincidence that the heart of the tree is related to the tree of life. It's related to the tree of knowledge. So that myth of Adam and Eve, I think, is sort of comes through in a very basic way for a lot of people. But the tree of life also exists outside of the myth of Adam and Eve. And actually, some people consider that there's only the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, and they're the same thing. And we could go on that.
That's a whole. That's a
That's
theological.
another book in and of itself. But when you think of the tree, it's kind of this idea of the bridge. I mean, if you think about what a tree does, it's got its roots in the ground, and it's reaching up to the sky, and it's kind of branching out, and there's a certain sort of similarity of shape and structure from the part that's above ground and the part that's below ground. And again, you have that cool fractal structure. But it's almost like it serves as a bridge between the sky and the earth. And that's a very, very important kind of idea, because you have, what is the connection between that ethereal thing and what's down at the ground and really happening? Or, some people think of it as the, the higher self and the manifest, or the possible and the what is actually in existence. And so the tree itself is a really important image for that specific process of, how things come into creation, the bridge between what isn't and what is, the possible and what might be. And then on the tree, here, I'm going to show you a little picture. So this is a picture of, this is actually a representation of the tree of life. Can you see?
Yes.
And it doesn't look much like a tree, but it's a symbolic representation. And then these things are called the spherot. This is a Kabbalistic image in general, but the spherot are like spheres. And I'll put this way. And the spheres are, they're sort of like different places of influence. They're almost like chakras. But, one might be sort of the influence of law. and another might be the influence of nature, and the other is this sort of influence of love in a kind of a quasi-Christ-like structure. And so, people sort of think about these different ideas about different places that you can be, and if you think about the tree of life as a metaphor, that you're in the place of influence from the emotions, or you're in the place of influence from the brain, or something like that. And then a lot of people are aware of tarot, but they don't necessarily know that tarot is a system that's actually Kabbalistic in nature, and specifically the major arcana, the 22 paths on the tree of life, are actually related specifically to paths between the different spheres on the tree of life. So there's actually 22 paths between these different spheres.
Huh.
And that's the equivalent of the major arcana of the tarot. So
Yeah, that's neat.
and they're actually each associated with a Hebrew letter, each one of those paths. And so you can sort of think about paths that you have through life, of the influence of, the relationship of these influences, and how you get from one sphere to another, all in kind of service of this idea of the relationship between what is and what isn't. And, a lot of religions deal with that question. But that's sort of some of the strength of Kabbalah. And I sort of got interested in this when I was in high school, and then I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I'm trying to think if I have the brain to talk about this part now. I'll try. We might have to redo this one. But we had talked about this a little bit, where I talked about, it was kind of off camera, sort of how you get from one place to another.
Mm-hmm.
And that in the Kabbalah there's this idea of almost like the void, the place where there's nothing in it. How do you get across it? It's almost like if you think about calculus, there's sort of a space where you've got those infinitesimal and the infinitesimals. Well, how can you add up infinitesimals and get actually to some distance? It's almost like the question in calculus, right?
Yeah.
And the key is you kind of have to make this like little jump, and you have to kind of actually assume that you make it to a certain degree, because if you think about adding up something which is infinitely small, you never actually get anywhere. So that question of how you get somewhere, well, sometimes it's just a matter of changing perspective and assuming that you're already there. And that's actually that idea of sort of changing perspective and assuming you're already there, and that maybe you've always already been there to some degree, is an incredibly important one for healing. Because, again, if you're trying to do things linearly, if you're trying to get from one spot to another, and you have to go on a path, and you never can actually jump, if the place you're on isn't necessarily on that path, you're never going to get there. But throughout nature, you actually do see that ability of all kinds of objects and things and stuff to jump from one place to another. And that's sort of like what that void is in Kabbalah, that place where you actually, if you're gonna make it somewhere, you have to make a jump, and you have to, and sometimes it can just be a change in perspective, or something like that, but it isn't necessarily always going to be one that makes sense. Sometimes it's going to be, you just do it, and there you are. You just assume that people manage to get places, and somehow they do.